On the southern edge of the populous parish of Paddington, in parallelogram bounded by Oxford and Cambridge Terrace on the south, Praed Street on the north, and by Edgware Road on the east and Spring Street on the west, lies an assemblage of mean streets, the drabness of which forms a remarkable contrast to the pretentious architectural grandeurs of Sussex Square and Lancaster Gate. Close by in these streets the observant will always find all those evidences of depressing semi-poverty which are more evident in London than in any other English city. The houses look as if laughter was never heard within them. Where the window blinds are not torn, they are dirty. The folk who come out of the doors wear anxious and depressed faces. Such shops as are there are mainly kept for the sale of food of poor quality. The taverns at the corners are destitute of attraction or pretension. Whoever wanders into these streets finds their sordid shabbiness communicating itself. He escapes, cast down, wondering who the folk are who live in those gray, lifeless cages. What they do, what they think, how life strikes them. Even the very sparrows which fight in the gutters for garbage are less lively than London sparrows usually are. As for the children who sit about the doorsteps, they look as if grass, the trees, the flowers, and the sunlight of the adjacent Kensington Gardens were as far away as the desert of Gobi. Within this slice of the town, indeed, life is lived, as it were, in a stagnant backwash, which nothing and nobody can stir. In an upper room of one of the more respectable houses in one of the somewhat superior streets of this neighborhood, a young man stood looking out of the window one November afternoon. It was then 5 o'clock, and the darkness was coming. All day a gentle, never-ceasing rain had been bringing the soot down from the dark skies upon the already dingy roofs. It was a dismal and miserable prospect upon which the watcher looked out, but not so miserable nor so dismal as the situation in which he just then found himself. The mean street beneath him was not more empty of cheerfulness than his pockets were empty of money and his stomach of food. He had spent his last penny on the previous day. It and 2 other coppers had gone on a mere mouthful of food and drink. Since their disappearance he had eaten nothing. And Hugh was now growing faint with hunger, and to add to his pains, someone, downstairs, was cooking herrings. The smell of the frying pan nearly drove him ravenous. He turned from the window presently and looked round at the small room behind him. It was a poor, ill-furnished place, cleanliness, though of a dingy sort, its only recommendation. There was a bed, and a washstand, and a chest of drawers, and a couple of chairs. A few shillings would have purchased the lot at any second-hand dealer's. In a corner stood the occupant's trunk. All the property he had in the world was in it, save a few books which were carefully ranged on the chimney-piece, and certain writing materials that lay on a small table. A sharp eye, glancing at the books and the writing materials, and at a few sheets of manuscript scattered on the blotting pad, would have been quick to see that here was the old tale, once more being lived out, of the literary aspirant who, at the very beginning of his career, was finding, by bitter experience, that, of all callings, that of literature is the most precarious. A half-hesitating tap at the door prefaced the entrance of a woman, the sort of woman who is seen in those streets by the score. A tallish, thinnish woman, old before her time, perpetually harassed, always anxious, always looking as if she expected misfortune. Her face was full of anxiety now as she glanced at her lodger who, on his part, flushed all over his handsome young face with conscious embarrassment. He knew very well what the woman wanted. He was powerless to respond to her appeal. "Mr. Luriston," she said in a half-whisper, "when do you think you'll be able to let me have a bit of money? It's going on for 6 weeks now, you know, and I'm that put to it, what with the rent and the rates." Andrew Luriston shook his head, not in denial, but in sheer perplexity. "Mrs. Flitwick," he answered, "I'll give you your money the very minute I get hold of it. I told you the other day I'd sold 2 stories. Well, I've asked to be paid for them at once, and the check might be here by any post. And I'm expecting another check, too. I'm surprised they aren't both here by this time. The minute they arrive, I'll settle with you. I'm wanting money myself as badly as you are." "I know that, Mr. Luriston," assented Mrs. Flitwick, "and I wouldn't bother you if I wasn't right pressed myself. But there's the landlord at me. He wants money tonight. And you'll excuse me for mentioning it, but till you get your checks, Mr. Luriston, why don't you rice a bit of ready money? Luristan looked round at his landlady with an air of surprised inquiry. "And how would I do that?" he asked. "You've a right good gold watch, Mr. Luristan," she answered. "Any pawnbroker, and there's plenty of him, I'm sure. You'd lend you a few pounds on that. Perhaps you've never had occasion to go to a pawnbroker before? No? Well, and I hadn't once upon a time. But I've had to, whether or no, since I came to letting lodgings, and if I'd as good a watch as yours is, I wouldn't go without money in my pocket. If you've any coming in, you can always get your goods back, and I should be thankful for something, Mr. Luristan, if it was but a couple o' pounds. My landlord's that hard." Luristan turned and picked up his hat. "All right, Mrs. Flitwick," he said quietly. "I'll see what I can do to I'd never even thought of it." When the woman had gone away, closing the door behind her, he pulled the watch out of his pocket and looked at it, an old-fashioned, good, gold watch, which had been his father's. No doubt a pawnbroker would lend money on it. But until then he had never had occasion to think off pawnbrokers. He had come to London nearly 2 years before, intending to make name, fame, and fortune by his pen. He had a little money to be going on with when he came. It had dwindled steadily, and it had been harder to replace it than he had calculated for. And at last there he was, in that cheap lodging, and at the end of his resources, and the check for his first 2 accepted stories had not arrived. Neither had a loan which, sorely against his will, he had been driven to request from the only man he could think of, an old schoolmate, far away in Scotland. He had listened for the postman's knock, hoping it would bring relief, for 4 long days, and not one letter had come, and Hugh was despairing and heartsick. But there was the watch. He went out presently, and on the stair, feebly lighted by a jet ofgas, he ran up against a fellow lodger, a young Jew, whom he knew by the name of Mr. Melchior Rubinstein, who occupied the rooms immediately beneath his own. He was a quiet, affable little person, with whom Luristan sometimes exchanged a word or two, and the fact that his sported rings on his fingers, a large pin in his tie, and a heavy watch chain, which was either real gold or a very good imitation, made Luristan think that he would give him some advice. He stopped him with a shy look and an awkward blush. "I say," he said, "the fact is, I'm a bit hard up temporarily, you know, and I want to borrow some money on my watch. Could you tell me where there's a respectable pawnbroker's?" Melky, known to everyone in the house by that familiar substitute for his more pretentious name, turned up the gas jet and then held out a slender, long-fingered hand. "Let's look at the watch," he said curtly, in a soft, lisping voice. "I know more than a bit about watches, mister." Luristan handed the watch over and watched Melky inquisitively as he looked at it, inside and out, in a very knowing and professional way. Melky suddenly glanced at him. "Now, you wouldn't like to sell this here bit of property, would you, Mr. Luristan?" he inquired, almost tweedlingly. "I'll give you 3 quid for it cash down." "Thank you, but I wouldn't sell it for worlds," replied Luristan. "Say 4 quid then," urged Melky. "Here, between friends, I'll give you 4.10. Spot cash, mind you." "No," said Luristan. "It belonged to my father. I don't want to sell, I want to borrow." Melky pushed the watch back into its owner's hand. "You go round into Praed Street, mister," he said, in businesslike fashion. "You'll see a shop there with Daniel Moltenius over it. He's a relation o' mine, he'll do what you want. Mention my name, if you like, he'll deal fair with you. And if you ever want to sell, don't forget me." Luristan laughed and went down the stairs and out into the dismal evening. It was only a step round to Praed Street, and within 5 minutes of leaving Melky, he was looking into Daniel Moltenius's window. He remembered now that he had often looked into it, without noticing the odd name above it. It was a window in which there were all sorts of curious things, behind a grill of iron bars, from diamonds and pearl-stowe old ivory and odds and ends of bric-a-brac. A collector of curiosities would have found material in that window to delay him for half an hour, but Luristan only gave one glance at it before hastening down a dark side passage to a door, over which was a faintly illuminated sign, showing the words, "Pledge Office." He pushed open that door and found himself before several small, boxed-off compartments, each just big enough to contain one person. They were all empty at that moment. He entered one, and seeing nobody about, tapped gently on the counter. He expected to see some ancient Hebraic figure present itself instead. Light steps came from some recess of the shop, and Luristan found himself gazing in surprise at Ayang, an eminently pretty girl, who carried some fancy needlework in her hand, and looked over it at him out of a pair of large, black eyes. For a moment the two gazed at each other in silence. "Yes," said the girl at last. "What can I do for you?" Luristan found his tongue. "Is Mr. Maltenius in?" he asked. The fact is, I want to see him." "Mr. Maltenius is out," answered the girl. "But I'm in charge if it's business." She was quietly eyeing Luristan over, and she saw his fresh complexioned face color vividly. "I do my grandfather's business when he's out," she continued. "Do you want to borrow some money?" Luristan pulled out the watch, with more blushes, and pushed it towards her. "That's just it," he answered. "I want to borrow money on that. Afriend of mine, fellow lodger, Mr. Melky Rubinstein said I could borrow something here. That's a real good watch, you know." The girl glanced at her customer with a swift and almost whimsical recognition of his innocence, and almost carelessly picked up the watch. "Oh, Melky sent you here, did he?" she said with a smile. "I see." She looked the watch over and snapped open the case. Then she glanced at Luristan. "How much do you want on this?" she asked.